Okay, guys. So this is a review of the skull for you folks. If you guys are watching this now on TV land, you'll see that it's been recorded. And what you want to do is pay attention to what I go over. I'm going to try to hit every single little item that's listed. And just so we're clear, my people that are not in my lab have not heard. You're only going to be tested on the structures listed in the lab manual. There are many, many other structures that will be pointed out in your book, and you can simply ignore those. You don't have to pay attention to those. Okay, so let's get started. So this is the skull with what's known as the calvaria, where the skull cap has been removed. It's cut straight off the top there. With the skull cap, we're going to look at the sutures. In fact, let's go ahead and look at the sutures right now. Let's start there. And by the way, you guys, if I forget something, of course, mention it. So here is a fake skull, but the sutures reside nonetheless. And the sutures you guys need to know about are the coronal suture, or frontal coronal, same thing. And really, what you need to pay attention to is that here's the frontal bone, by the way, and the frontal bone is divided into the two is sutured into, articulates with the two right and left parietal bones by way of this frontal or coronal suture. Okay, that's it. We get into this part here where people were asking me, they're getting into like, okay, well, what about the suture when it comes into this sphenoid bone right here? And I say, don't worry about that, right? We're just going over the large, very obvious sutures that we have here. That would be the sphenoidal frontal suture, but we're not worried about that, okay? So moving on, then we have a suture here. This is, if we split this guy right in half, it would be a mid-sagittal suture, or sagittal cut rather, so therefore that's the sagittal suture. And then posterior, we have a suture, and this suture is in the back, and it separates, it's the lambdoid suture here. And in various people, these can be various shapes. It's not always going to look identical to this. Remember that here we typically have we could have Wilmerian bones. Those are those extra bones that are sutured in. Regardless though, this is the occipital lobe, and here, again, the parietal lobes. And this lambdoid suture separates the single occipital bone, rather. I said lobe, that's actually from the brain, but the occipital bone from the right and left parietal bones. Okay. Then we have a final suture here. I'm going to grab the other skull because it's much easier to see with this guy, the real skull. And you'll notice that here is our temporal bone, and there is a suture that separates this bone primarily from the parietals, and therefore, I guess this is squamous in nature, or I don't know why they call it that, but that's the squamous suture. So you guys need to know, again, the squamous suture, the lambdoid suture here, and then you need to know the frontal and the sagittal suture, which I just pointed out. And last but not least, there's the metopic suture, which again, this was just chipped. That's not cool. There's a metopic suture, and the remnants of that would be right here. The metopic suture, by the time the kid turns, I think by 1, that metopic suture no longer exists. So you just need to know, of course, all of these skulls are over the person died well over the age of 1, so you just need to know the relative location of that suture. Okay? Are there questions on sutures? Yes, go ahead.
Do we need to know the frontal nasal suture?
Oh yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that's listed, right? That's easy. Look, this is the frontal bone. Here are the nasal bones. See that suture right there that separates the two? That's the frontal nasal suture. Very simple. Okay? Come on in. Okay, so let's go over some bones then, and then we'll talk about specific parts of bones. This is the maxillary bone. It is fused. It's the result of fusion of right and left, but by the time you're an adult, it's the maxillary bone, singular. And the maxillary bone basically makes up the upper jaw, if you will, and it also makes the roof of the mouth. So let's go ahead and check out the roof of the mouth. This is what we call the bony palate. I'll take that A off there. And you'll see that The maxillary bone, this is the palatine process of the maxillary bone. That's, again, just a fancy area or way of saying this is the roof of the mouth. Now, the bony palate is also made up, contributed to by another bone. That is right here. This is the palatine bone. And you can see the suture right across there that separates the palatine bone from the palatine process of the maxillary bone. The maxillary bone is a bone with sinus. True or false? True. It has a sinus in it along with 3 other bones we'll mention. And the maxillary sinus is located right in here. If I was to drill a hole, whoops, I'm sorry guys. Let me know if I do that, okay? If I was to drill a hole in here and in here, this whole area in here would be open bone. And that's where the maxillary sinus, both the right and the left maxillary sinus would be. What is this foramen that's under the orbit? Infraorbital foramen, right? Well, we have a supraorbital foramen up here. Again, this serves for blood passageway for blood vessels and or nerves. In this case, it's both. The maxillary bone, what else can I say about the maxillary bone? Is basically ends here at the cheekbone, which there's a suture here, again, you don't need to know what that is. And that ends, and we start now the zygomatic bone. And that's, loosely, people call that the cheekbone, right? Because this makes up your cheeks. And the zygomatic bone, again, the maxillary bone contributes to the orbit of the eye. The zygomatic bone also contributes to the orbit of the eye, the frontal bone, the lacrimal, the palatine, the ethmoid, and which one am I missing? Sphenoid. All of those guys, right? Please feed my zebra. Okay. What else? I think, did I cover the maxillary bone? I think we've exhausted everything on there. Okay. Moving on. So again, the zygomatic bone makes up the cheekbone, and it contributes. It's one part of what we call the zygomatic arch. That's the structure that you see right here, and you can see that the zygomatic arch, there's this opening here, which again serves as a passageway for what's known as the temporalis muscle that's involved with chewing, with mastication. I have to say that very carefully, all right, and enunciate. And this right here, this zygomatic bone, this is the temporal bone, and both the temporal and the zygomatic bone contribute to the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch itself is contributed to by the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. I know that may be confusing, but if you look at it in the book, it's not that confusing. It just needs to know which bones these are, and there's processes, you just reverse the name there. Now again, this zygomatic arch is there for a reason. It's not just to give you nice rosy cheeks. It is there for the purpose of surface area for muscle attachment. These are your masseter muscles, your big fat chewing muscles attach here, and again, your temporalis muscle attaches in this what we call temporal fossa here in that area. Now, speaking of another temporal fossa, we're moving on with the temporal bone. This is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Here's a question for you. What articulates right here, specifically the condylar head of the condylar process of the mandible? What do I mean by that? Well, here's a mandible, and this is the coronoid process, right? Coronoid, I was thinking coronoid. And this is the condylar process. Everybody look here, this is the condylar process, and this is the head of the condylar process of the mandible. And you guys, and this probably won't line up properly, but let's give it a shot. You can see that this is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone here, and right here, and those heads then are going to, oh look, it pretty much lines up properly. So what you can see here is that we have this temporal mandibular joint right here. Do you guys see this? Okay? This is a very lax temporal mandibular joint. In other words, there'd be a lot of travel here. And some people, again, have more laxity in this particular joint, If they open their jaw really wide, they take a big yawn, it slips forward like that. You guys see that? And it will actually keep the jaw from closing, which is a very scary scenario to be in, apparently, I've heard. So you push your molars down, and you push them down and back, and you just you basically unsubluxate that joint right there. Okay. So this joint, we're going to learn in 2 weeks from now, is a condyloid joint, and condyloid joints, if you paid attention to the lecture, allow for movement of how many axes? Two. Okay? There's this axis, and then there's this axis going back and forth, and we know that we can circumduct our jaw, right? That's why. I digress. That's for another class. Okay? The temporal bone itself is a very busy bone. Lots of stuff going on. Not only does it contribute to the zygomatic arch, but the temporal bone also has the external acoustic meatus. That's our ear hole, right? It's got the mandibular fossa for our temporal mandibular joint. It's got the mastoid process. It's filled with mastoid air cells. It aids in hearing. And it also serves as a muscle attachment. This muscle that attaches here is called your sternocleidomastoid muscle. That's the muscle that turns your neck back and forth. And we'll, of course, explore that in a few weeks from now. The temporal bone, if I turn it around and I look at it from the interior of the skull, you can see this labeled D right here. This whole broadened structure is called the petrous part, or portion of the temporal bone. And this is a very important structure because it houses our hearing and equilibrium apparatus. All right? Anything else we need to know about the temporal bone? Oh, styloid process, thank you. So for that, we're going to have to go to a fake skull because guess what? The styloid process is long gone. Bear with me just a second. And you see this little fang looking structure right here. You guys see that? That little fang structure is in fact the styloid process of the temporal bone, and it serves as attachment point for swallowing muscles. Very, very fragile structure that we're looking at right here. That's why on all of the real skulls it's been broken off. Except that maybe the skeleton in the closet over here has it available. Okay? That was the temporal bone. Now, let's go ahead and explore the ethmoid and sphenoid bone. And as you guys know, those guys are embedded inside of the skull. And there's a limited view of those. And the first thing I want to point out is with the ethmoid bone, what you're looking at here, this top structure in this area is the top of the ethmoid bone, the superior region of the ethmoid bone. And from that view, what you can see is the crista galli. You guys see this very sharp little, I call it the shark fin here, and if you feel it on a real skull, it is in fact very sharp. That serves as an attachment point for your meninges that hold your brain, keep your brain from knocking around inside of your skull. We also have, you'll notice that there's these little holes. See, if I move it, you can see through some areas there, right? You guys see those holes? Those holes are foramina, olfactory foramina, on the cribriform plate. So again, I repeat, the view of the ethmoid bone, the structures of the ethmoid bone that you can see from a superior view are the crista galli, that little shark fin, and then the cribriform plate, which contains these little olfactory foramina. Again, those serve as a way that your olfactory nerve, your smelling nerve, cranial nerve 1, can actually penetrate up into your brain. The nerves have to pass through something. They just don't magically go through bone, they have to pass through foramina. And then, if we look at the ethmoid bone from